push on because otherwise time is getting on, and if I have to record it tomorrow again, I will. So we wanted to talk today about the Kybalion. The Kybalion is a rather interesting document that was published in 1908 by the authors called themselves the Three Initiates. And what you're looking at there is the French cover of the French version of the book. It's very interesting. It was actually published in America. It was published by the Chicago publishing house that published a lot of yoga workbooks or yoga textbooks. And that's interesting in itself because that gives you some kind of indication of the material that publishers were publishing and therefore the authors that wrote for them. But the Kybalion is a very interesting textbook, a very interesting set of ideas. The Kybalion claims to be the essence of the teachings of somebody called Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Hermes Trismegistus wasn't a real person, we don't think. What he was a name used by lots of different occult writers to share ancient knowledge, maybe from the Egyptians and from the Babylonians, and it all got sort of mixed together. And when people started to write things down, they created this character of Hermes Trismegistus, that is Hermes the thrice great. He was really important in terms of astrology, alchemy, and taumaturgy, which is magic. And a lot of the things that were written in his name started to feed into the revivalism of occultism in the Middle Ages. The book is said to outline the 7 principles of hermetic knowledge, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of time in looking at right now. The problem we've got to address first is who were the 3 initiates, and nobody really knows because they didn't advertise that they'd written the book. However, a guy called William Walker Atkinson is probably one of the key contributors. He was in part a part of something called the New Thought movement in the 1800s. We'll talk more about that later. Another guy was probably Paul Foster Case, who had an interest in the Kabbalah and the occult, produced a number of books, and actually founded something called Builders of the Atidium, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's a character called Ellis Gilowitz who wrote on the Kabbalah and Passion and Power, all part of this New Thought movement that was looking at the psychology of how people could become better people. And then other people could have been Michael Whitty, who is a colleague of Paul Foster Case, as well as other people. Harriet Case was Paul's wife at the time. Mabel Collins was a theosophist. Claude Bragdon was an architect who was interested in mystic geometry. And the other character, Claude Alexander, was actually a stage magician. If you think of Derren Brown, well, Claude Alexander was the Derren Brown of his time. But he was, rather than being an atheist like Derren Brown is, Claude Alexander was very much a theist and was very much into the New Thought movement ideas. So we don't know who the 3 initiates were, but we do have a sense that William Walker was the key one, possibly the Paul Foster Case, and then whoever else came along. What's interesting about those characters is they were involved with different, let's call them fraternal or magical societies. The New Thought movement was also called the Higher Thought movement, and it was a very Christian-focused movement that included in its membership people like William James, who was the father of psychology. And in fact, the whole idea of positive psychology comes from the New Thought movement. It was the idea about why can't we just be happy? And what's the psychology of happiness? And of course, the New Thought movement was all about understanding the nature of the Christian God, if you like. Theosophy, which literally means knowledge of God, we know was developed by Elena Blavatsky and became a worldwide movement. And of course, they were exploring what it meant to be a spiritual being living on a material plane. The Builders of the Atidium was a mystery school, and again, it was Paul Foster Case. Most of the work within that mystery school focuses on the Kabbalah and the Tarot. I've been a member of that particular group for some years now, and it's really interesting. And the last group that's really important that developed from studies of the Kybalion was the Fraternity of Inner Light, which was founded by Dion Fortune in the 1900s. And the reason she's there, she's out of the time frame of some of these people, but she's certainly in the time frame of being inspired by some of these works. So the Kybalion is a summary of occult or mystical teachings published in 1904 that influenced or had an influence in loads of mystical or occult societies of the time. Many of them were influenced by the Golden Dawn, which was a sort of Victorian magical society. But around this time, as we explored, I think last time, many occult societies or spiritual societies were growing and developing because as a response to the mechanistic results of the Industrial Revolution. So the common threads of all these societies, many of which are still extant. This is the symbol for the New Thought movement, which exists today. This one here is a symbol from the builders of the Otidium, which exists today. You can join that. This is the Fraternity of Inner Light, and this is the Theosophy Society. We could spend a long time going into the symbolism between these three particularly, but those of you that saw the alchemy one or the planetary symbol one last time will certainly recognize things in here and things in here, which we can talk about later. The common threads for all these societies, of course, was the search for personal enlightenment, developed personally and psychologically as well as spiritually. And that's the thing that sets some of these original societies apart from aspects of the modern New Age movement, who focus on spiritual development and raising their vibrations spiritually, rather than actually looking at the personal and the psychological growth that needs to go alongside that. In fact, most of these societies will have insisted that anybody undertaking a spiritual path actually take on board a psychotherapeutic path as well. There's a search for knowledge of God in whatever form you see that to be. Now, the word God has got very Christian connotations in our culture, but we're meaning God here in a very broad context. They all offered frameworks for exploring our cosmic connection, our connection with the universe. They were all focused on the idea of gnosis and wisdom, and that came through symbolism and the unconscious mind. And this is really important because, I say, last time we talked about symbolism. If you missed last week's, the last Moot, you can go and look at it on the school's website. But they all share this idea that the only way to know the universe is to know yourself. And the only way to understand divinity is to understand divinity within yourself. So therefore, symbolism and the unconscious mind were very important in these movements. They also are fraternal in the sense that each of the organizations shared a particular code of ethics or values, and that's common with most societies today. And they all emphasize the need to recognize personal responsibility. So when we look at the Kybalion, we find that it identifies 7 principles. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly and then we can talk about them. The 7 principles were seen as 7 guiding ideas that suggested deeper truths. Now, in the Kybalion, it was maintained that these were the truths that came from Hermes Trismegistus, which in turn came from ancient Egypt and Egypt spirituality. The quote that you see there is directly from the Kybalion. And the idea is that in terms of Gnosticism, in terms of mystical traditions, you cannot learn it from a book. You've got to experience it, and it's usually from lip to ear. The idea that you are exposed to teachings from somebody who's been themselves involved and linked to this underground stream of knowledge. Interestingly, from lip to ear is almost a direct translation of what the word Kabbalah means, but that's another story. We spoke last time also about the fact that if I use a word, it's a representation of the thing I'm talking about. So if I talk about love, it's not love, it's my representation of the word love. And so the idea behind all of this stuff is that you have to dig deeper than the word. Now, you're going to find out that I've got a particular soapbox in a minute. Some recent or more modern New Age writers, in particular writers of things about the law of attraction and Rhonda Byrne and The Secret, stole this stuff. And I think because they didn't actually go back to the sources or encourage their readers to go back to the sources, you're left with a materialistic view of these principles. If you think about law of attraction, most of the way that gets promoted these days is, write down your wishes and the universe will provide. Well, that's partly what the 7 principles are about, but it's a gross oversimplification of just the material aspect of that. Again, cosmic ordering and those things that have been promoted much in New Age thinking these days, and the idea of manifestation of things just by will is a simplification of a much deeper set of principles. So let's look at these 7 principles and then we can have a chat. The first of these principles, if I can get the screen to work, is the principle of mentalism. Now this is again directly from the Kybalion, 1904. And the idea was that everything is mind. And if you think about that for a minute, everything that exists that you can name, that you can experience, has got to exist in your mind. And the concept, therefore, is that to understand the nature of the world and the universe, we need to understand the nature of our mind and our mental state. There are some people who take a spiritual path who never get themselves mentally balanced before they take the spiritual journey, and therefore they end up being derailed by their own thoughts. And the odd idea is also here is that you have to have a thought of a thing before you can manifest or see that the thing exists. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there is an idea that you cannot see a thing if you cannot label it. There's a wonderful story of when Christopher Columbus sailed across the sea and apparently landed in the Americas. The shaman that was looking out to sea saw something, but didn't know what it was because he didn't have a concept of what a galleon or a ship was. So he watched the patterns on the sea and only understood after the boats got closer and he saw people on them that these were modes of conveyance. Until he could see the people on them, he didn't know what they were. So he had no language for them, so he had no thought form for them. And the importance of thinking and language are so closely tied together. And that's why I'm a real big exponent of something called neurolinguistic programming, but that's, again, is another story. If you think something, it will affect your emotions and will affect your behaviors in order to construct a thing. And that's crucial too, especially in this time when we're dealing with certain elements of the unknown world around us. Nature seems to be fighting back with what it's sending us in terms of viruses. And the way that we think about those things affects the way we respond to those things. Again, more about that when we talk about it later. So the principle of mentalism is about mind. Interestingly, Derham Brown calls himself a mentalist because mentalism has 3 definitions. Mentalism is a theatrical art form where you are talking about the power of the mind. Mentalism is a philosophical approach about everything is mind, and mentalism is also a way of describing, shall we say, the mental conditions and states of people. The second principle is this principle of correspondence. Now, most of you, if you've been involved in paganism or aspects of the esoteric schools, will know about this. It's the idea of as above, so below. Now, that's got a real power because the notion is that if I can find a reference in myself to the universe, then I am in the universe and the universe is me. And we're connected in this kind of really powerful interplay of as above, so below. And this is about one thing can represent another thing, which is why in a lot of magical literature, you find that planets are associated or correspond to certain qualities. Certain colors correspond to certain attributes. The 4 elements have correspondences to do with the mind, with intellect, with the body, not just with directions. And these correspondences work, according to Kybalion, on 3 levels: the physical plane, the mental plane, and the spiritual plane. Any of you that know a little bit about Carl Jung and know a bit about psychology and also Freud will automatically recognize this as the way that some psychologists talk about the mind, the body, and the spirit, or it's how holistic therapists talk about the mind, the body, and the spirit, or they talk about the physical plane, the mental plane, and the plane that we can aspire to. So that's the second law, the principle of correspondence. This is the one that you will all again know. It's the principle of vibration. The Kybalion wrote, and again, remember, because these guys, and I'm saying guys in a non-gender specific way, but it probably was guys, apart from Paul Foster Case's wife, were writing down stuff that existed before they wrote it down. They were writing down teachings, summarizing teachings. And the principle of vibration is really simple. It's the idea that everything in the universe is in movement. The superficial understanding of this is that when you say people are at a higher vibrational level, man, and they've awoken their spirit to the higher vibrations of the universe, that's an oversimplification of what this is about. And anybody who starts to understand this tradition starts to look at what vibration really means. Interestingly, the spiritual idea of vibration is not the scientific understanding of the word vibration. And people sometimes mix the two things together to create all kinds of rather spurious and diverting philosophies that may or may not be helping them move towards some kind of truth. This is an interesting principle, the polarity one. This is very simple about everything has two sides. The idea is one thing can't exist without the other thing. Love cannot exist without the concept of hate, because you can't have a definition of love if you've got no definition of its opposite. Safety and security against insecurity. They have to exist as pairs and polarities. And that's a really interesting philosophical idea, because between these polarities, you have north and south, you have east and west, you actually have hot and cold. There are gradients between the polarities. For life to exist in the universe, you can't have all one thing. I hear people speaking about wanting to bring about global harmony, which I'd love the concept of in terms of us getting on with each other. However, you can't have static, unchanging peace and calm, because the universe isn't like that. The universe is a mixture of chaos and order. And we have to understand that within the chaos there's order, and within the order there's chaos. Modern science, in terms of something called thermodynamics, speaks of the idea that order tends towards chaos. And they would argue that energy in the universe, from the Big Bang or whatever, is now becoming more and more chaotic as it dissipates. And we see that chaos expressing itself in scientific terms, as well as, from this point of view, spiritual terms. So moving on from polarity, we've got this idea of the principle of rhythm, which is the bits between the two polarities. We're oscillating between them, backwards and forwards, and we're always on this continuum. We may feel totally sad one day, but we may feel happy the next. But what was the journey between those two polarities? That's really interesting. This morning I was on some training for mental first aid work, and one of the concepts they were talking about there is that, you know, people who start to struggle with issues of life can define themselves as having mental health issues. And it's how people get stuck into the mental health issues and they don't have the resources or the support, or should we say the approaches that help pull them back into what we call the ups and downs of normal life. So principle of rhythm is that, well, it's that wonderful bird song, isn't it? For every time there is a season, and there is a reason under heaven and earth. This you will know, this principle you'll know as the principle of karma. Now, I'm not going to go too much onto this, but the Western version of karma is not the Vedic version of karma, or the Asian version of karma. We have taken karma in the New Age movement and turned it into like a cosmic bank account. If I do something good today, it will reward me in my future life. Maybe that's the case. Karma is simply about cause and effect. it's instant karma, as John Lennon would have said. So what you do today will actually affect the choices you have tomorrow. And individual responsibility comes into an understanding of the process of cause and effect. If you spend a lot of your life focusing on the problems you've had, then you're not moving forward, and therefore you're not generating the seeds of tomorrow, and all the other principles fall into place. Principles of mentality, the principles of polarity, and that. We're nearly there, guys. I'm sorry I'm going quite quickly, but this will be available online. The next principle is the principle of gender. And it's the idea that gender isn't everything. Now, this is not sexual gender. It is not gender identity or sexuality. It's the opposites, the yin and the yang, the masculine, the feminine, the receptive, the dynamic, the active, the passive. And everything exists within these principles. You yourself have these opposites existing with your own psychological makeup. Carl Jung called it the anima and the animus, knowing ourself as both an expression of passivity and receptivity. We're there. That's the 7 principles, which we can now talk about in a moment. I like these quotes. There's a few quotes from the Kybalion which you may like to just think about for a moment and just focus on. One of the reasons that people get involved in what we can call occultism or spiritual development or mystery schools is that they want to understand themselves and their relation to the cosmos. And they want to feel that there is some kind of way of not controlling the fates, but understanding the flow of the universe. And this is a nice quote from the Kybalion, which is talking about, you know, are we going to be the pawns in the chessboard of life, or are we going to understand how we can manage being a pawn? It says here about, you know, we think hereditary and suggestion and other outward causes are moving us around. And in fact, if we lay ourselves victim to the outside world, we can't take any control over that, which is why the internal worlds are really important in terms of spiritual development. The video there, guys, the people, I love this quote because people say to me things like, if you're on a spiritual path, then you must be full of bliss. I'm not so sure that is the case. People who go around with a sense of bliss all the time, I'm just wondering how connected they are to the now, because life is about polarities, as the Kybalion teaches. And so we are able to experience joy and sorrow. And there is an argument that if we can't experience one, we may not value the other. We're getting there, guys. You can. There is some very sound advice from the Kybalion. Incidentally, you can obtain the Kybalion online for a few pence as of Kindle or something like that. But you can also find PDF versions and translations of it, which I heartily recommend you read, because I'm just giving you a brief summary of this stuff. But here, the thing is, it's so important. There are some people who want to say that I don't want to live in this physical world, I want to become of spirit. And the problem with that is they're denying themselves. They're denying themselves their experience of the world, which is as important as their experience of the spiritual realms. The problem I think we have is if you do this stuff outside of some kind of supported or mentored training, you forget that there are values and ethics that are linked in with this. And the values and ethics are the things that will actually keep you on the path of becoming true to your ideals. The next quote, very near there, guys, the next quote I love. We have a lot of people who are Gnostics. They believe that the gnosis, the truth of their own identity, means that they are God. And they'll go around and say, I am God. And as the quote says here, that's like Uriah Heep or McCall or a Dickens novel saying, I am Dickens. Or, you know, somebody out of Shakespeare's like Malvolio and Shakespeare say, I am Shakespeare. It's not quite what that I am God statement is about according to the Kybalion. It is about the mind of the all exists within the mind of us, and we exist within the mind of everything. And therefore, everything that makes up the universe is within us, and everything that is in us is part of the universe. So it is about we've made God in our own image, but we're also gods in our own image. And it's how we rationalize those two things and bring them together into a practical, powerful, and inclusive sense of self and our communities.